All right, guys, next unit, unit number 3. So if you're on board and you're on track and you're going module by module, you've completed our first test. Second test was on organic chem, or molecules of life. And this will be our third unit on cells. Just to kind of go through this, start with the cell theory, that all living things, in order to be considered a living thing, you have to be made of cells. Cells are the most basic unit, structure, and function in an organism, of structure and function in an organism. And cells come only from the reproduction of existing cells. So, chicken and egg, right? All right. So, how do we define cell? A cell is the smallest unit of matter that can carry life. A lot of times people can confuse atoms with cells. Cells are comprised of billions of atoms, if that tells you anything. So cells are very small, but they're made up of countless atoms. So anyway. Okay, we're going to start by talking about some of the different structures you'll find through cells. And I didn't really encounter this one until I was deep into college. For some reason, this didn't get mentioned that much when I was in high school. But this is a huge, huge deal if you go on to take nursing or medicine, veterinary medicine, any type where you're going to be helping out humans. Just your knowledge of the lipid bilayer that surrounds each cell, okay, the cell membrane, the sac that holds a cell together, and then the little sacs that hold all the organelles within that cell together. The term that we use to describe the lipid bilayer is selectively permeable. It lets certain things through and certain things that the cell needs, and it removes things, allows certain things to leave the cell. So in order for a cell to maintain homeostasis, it has to be able to take in what it needs, either through a process called endocytosis or through different proteins that are embedded all throughout the cells. So think of the lipid bilayer kind of like a bendable wall, and then think of proteins that are embedded all throughout the lipid bilayer as bouncers or doorways that'll let certain things through. So anyway, another factor that we think about when we study cells is something called the surface area to volume ratio. So if cells are too big, needed materials needed things like, say, potassium or sodium, chlorine ions, whatever the cell needs, not able to penetrate it all the way through to the center of the cell. So a cell needs to be fairly small. It needs to be really small in order to uptake everything that it needs and allow that stuff to travel all throughout the cell. Also, the cell has to be able to defend itself, and the greater the surface area, the more there would be to defend. And so the cell needs to be small by design in order for material to transfer all the way through the cell and also to defend itself. The two main types of cells that we're going to touch on are prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And when I study prokaryotes and eukaryotes, I often compare them in complexity to New York City and Manhattan and Dallas, Oregon. So if you think about how complicated New York City is, you just have to think about it this way. What if you were standing in Times Square in New York City, and it was 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 a.m., and you had a craving for Yiddish cuisine? If you wanted some good Yiddish food, you probably could just turn to whoever's walking by or look it up on your phone and to Siri and say, Siri, nearest Yiddish restaurant. And it would tell you of a Yiddish delicatessen maybe a block or two away. If you were standing by the courthouse in Dallas and you said at 2 a.m., man, I could really go for some Yiddish food, you probably would be hard-pressed to find very many people that even knew such thing as Yiddish food existed. So to give you an idea, that's just kind of an analogy how complicated Dallas is compared to New York. The same can be said when you're comparing prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So prokaryotes don't have a nucleus, they don't have organelles, they're just basically really a cell membrane that surrounds the DNA that makes it possible for it to reproduce. It's not very complicated. Also quite a bit smaller usually. If you were to compare a prokaryote to a eukaryotic cell, you'd say a golf ball compared to a watermelon in size. Eukaryotic cells are very complicated. They've got a nucleus, which contains DNA. They've got all the different organelles we're going to talk about, and those organelles are themselves bound by that lipid bilayer we talked about. So you've got things like an endoplasmic reticulum and a Golgi apparatus and lysosomes and mitochondria and all the things that you can find throughout a eukaryotic cell. Okay, just to pinpoint and focus on some of the organelles found within a eukaryotic cell. So we'd start with the main control center of the cell, and this is what contains the DNA of the cell, the nucleus. Think of it like the yolk of an egg, I guess. But the nucleus has all the DNA inside the cell. It's surrounded by a nuclear membrane. And even within the nucleus, there's a thing called the nucleolus, where ribosomes are generated. And that's a concentrated area within the nucleus. But the nucleus is where you'll find the chromosomes. The chromosomes are what are made of DNA, a material called chromatin, but that is DNA. Okay, this is one of the long-running jokes when people talk about what they learned in high school and how necessary it was for life. People often say, man, I can't pay my taxes. Nobody taught me how to pay my taxes, or nobody taught me how to change the oil in my car, but I know that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of a cell. Well, here I am. I'm going to be just like every other biology teacher in the history of school, and I'm going to tell you that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. It's the place where ATP is generated. ATP is the currency of energy for a cell. And the mitochondria is spread throughout the cytosol. Lots of mitochondria in a very active cell and not as many mitochondria in a less active cell. But cytoplasm is the gelatinous goo that sort of goes all throughout the cell. If you watch Ghostbusters, they talk about ectoplasm. That's what a ghost will dump on you if you mess with it. Well, plasm means goo. So cytoplasm is just the goo throughout the cell. And it's a necessary goo because it keeps moisture in and also allows impulses to travel throughout the cell. Ribosomes are the workbenches where proteins are constructed, and they're found all throughout the cell as well. Ribosomes are very tiny. Other organelles. A vesicle is like a package. So when the cell's taking something in or removing something, it takes something in through a process called endocytosis, where the outside lipid bilayer just sort of folds around a package, something the cell needs, and it goes into the cell by form of a vesicle. And then it often eliminates things from the cell the same way. The Golgi apparatus will package it up and get rid of it. Lysosomes are little digesters throughout the cell that sort of break things down. So when bacteria take in food through endocytosis, lysosomes will break it down. Lysosomes are found a lot through in your salivary glands in your mouth because that's where digestion starts. So lysosomes are the kind of like the recycle plant of a cell. Your cell's highway system could be is a best way to describe the endoplasmic reticulum. The endoplasmic reticulum helps move things out into the extracellular area, and there's two parts to the endoplasmic reticulum. You've got the rough endoplasmic reticulum and the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. The rough ER is rough because it's covered with ribosomes. and the smooth ER doesn't have ribosomes on it. There's also ribosomes floating free throughout the cytosol. So another organelle is the Golgi apparatus, which is kind of like the post office of a cell, and it exports things out of the cell. Cytoskeleton are the little filaments and spiderwebby proteins found throughout the cytoplasm that sort of hold it in place. And centrioles are kind of like fishing reels. They show up when it's time for the cell to divide. We'll talk a lot about centrioles in the next unit when we talk about mitosis, which is cell division. Some cells are mobile, able to get around, particularly bacteria cells. Cells that can kind of swim through the water might do so one of two ways. The tiny little hair-like structures that surround a cell, if there's many things that help it propel it through the water, like a paramecium does, which is a bacteria that swims. You can Google that. Paramecium is a C, paramecium. Anyway, those are propelled through the water using something called cilia. Cilia are little appendages that look like hairs all around a cell. Or if you think of the way a sperm travels through the water with that tail, it uses something called a flagella. And that also another bacteria called a euglena, spelled kind of like Eugene, the Oregon, but euglena. A euglena also propels itself through the water using flagella. So those are two different ways that cells can travel. Okay, so if you look at this guy real quick, let's look at some of its features. The purpley bubble right here that my mouse is floating around on, that's the nucleus. The dark area inside is the nucleolus, where ribosomes are constructed. Really close to the nucleus here is the ER, the endoplasmic reticulum, and you've got the smooth ER out here. You've got the Golgi apparatus here, and there's some mitochondria. This has a few mitochondria. Then there's lysosomes out here for digesting. There's even a close-up feature that shows the lipid bilayer, the membrane that surrounds it. And then you've got all the filaments all throughout the cell. Plant cells differ from animal cells in that plant cells are surrounded by a cell wall made of cellulose. That cell wall is structure and support that makes that cell, that plant cell kind of hold it in place. You also, if you dehydrate a cell and allow it to wilt, you're taking all of the water out of this big sac in the middle called a vacuole. If you water your plant, that vacuole will swell back up into what's called a hypotonic state, and then you'll see that the leaves are really robust looking and full looking. Chloroplasts are kind of like solar panels. They absorb the energy from the sun so that a leaf can make glucose, its food. So chloroplasts really move around that plant cell when you hit the right temperature and the right amount of light hitting it, and they're pretty slowed down and stationary at nighttime or when it's too cold to generate glucose. You won't find any chloroplasts in the root of a plant because they don't need chloroplasts. And chloroplasts are usually full of a green pigment called chlorophyll, which gives plants their green look. So plants have all the other organelles that you'll see too: endoplasmic reticulum, mitochondria, lysosomes, all those things. So you can do a little compare and contrast. If you want to go back and pause that, that's actually a great way to take notes. What do plant cells have? What do animal cells have? Like, you won't find flagella or cilia on plant cells because they don't need them. Okay, cellular organization. So if you're going to look at a collection of similar cells, you would refer to that as a tissue. So you'd have skin cells that make up the tissue of your skin. And if you're a burn victim, might need a tissue graft. So they take maybe from the back of his calf, they might take skin and they replace it on his face so that he doesn't have as much scarring. A bunch of tissues might conform to form an organ, so like a kidney or a liver. And then an organ might work with other organs to find an organ system, like a digestive system or a circulatory system. and then organ systems work together to form an organism.